May 1941. By that point in the war, Britain was not fighting for territory, it was fighting for survival. Every day, thousands of tons of food, fuel, and ammunition crossed the Atlantic. If those sea lanes failed, Britain would not last the year. Then Germany sent a single warship into that ocean. The German battleship Bismarck was not deployed to win a battle. It was deployed to force a reaction. And it worked. Within days, Britain committed almost its entire home fleet, risking its own survival, to stop one ship. Warships were pulled from other duties. Convoys were left exposed. Air patrols were stretched thin across thousands of miles of open sea. This was not panic, it was calculation. Because if the Bismarck reached the open Atlantic and remained there, Britain would be forced to choose what to defend and what to abandon. Once the Bismarck entered the Atlantic, there was no version of this story in which it was allowed to survive. The German battleship Bismarck was not built to win decisive fleet battles. By the time it was commissioned, German naval planners already understood a fundamental reality. They could not match Britain ship for ship. The Royal Navy was larger, more experienced, and spread across a global network of bases and sea lanes that Germany could not challenge directly. Any attempt to fight a traditional battle for control of the seas would lead to attrition Germany could not sustain. So the Bismarck was designed for a different purpose. It was intended to operate independently, far from friendly ports, beyond immediate support, forcing Britain to defend vast stretches of ocean with limited resources. The ship was not meant to hold territory or dominate a fixed area. It was meant to create pressure simply by being present where it should not be. In technical terms, the Bismarck combined long-range, heavy armor, and enough firepower to overwhelm any escort that might be sent against it. But those characteristics were not ends in themselves. They were enablers. What mattered strategically was what the ship could force the enemy to do. Every confirmed report of the Bismarck at sea triggered a chain reaction. Convoys had to be reinforced. Patrol zones had to be expanded. Capital ships were held back from other missions, just in case the situation escalated. These were not optional precautions. They were necessary responses to uncertainty. The Bismarck did not need to sink large numbers of ships to justify its existence. It only needed to remain beyond reach, in the open Atlantic, where its exact position was unknown and its next move unpredictable. That uncertainty alone could disrupt schedules, stretch escort coverage, and complicate every convoy decision British commanders had to make. The cost was not measured only in ships sunk, but in time, fuel, and attention diverted across an entire ocean. In German naval thinking, this was commerce raiding at the highest level, not conducted by submarines operating quietly below the surface, but by a capital ship large enough to demand an immediate and disproportionate response, yet mobile enough to avoid direct confrontation. It was a strategy built on imbalance, and this was precisely the scenario Britain could not accept. In May 1941, the mission of the German battleship Bismarck was not to seek battle. German naval planners understood that a direct confrontation with the Royal Navy would lead to a war of attrition they could not afford. Britain's strength lay not in individual ships, but in its ability to absorb losses and continue operating across the world's oceans. The Bismarck was sent on a mission designed to avoid that kind of war entirely. Its objective was simple in concept, but difficult in execution. Break into the Atlantic and then disappear. Once beyond the narrow seas of Northern Europe, the ship would operate independently, supported only by supply vessels and distant coordination. There would be no nearby friendly ports, no dockyards for repairs, no immediate reinforcements if something went wrong. This isolation was not accidental. It was central to the mission. German planners understood the risk. They also understood the potential payoff. If the Bismarck succeeded in reaching the open Atlantic, it would force Britain to defend an ocean far too large to control completely. Even the possibility of its presence would compel the Royal Navy to spread its forces thin. For Britain, the danger was immediate and structural. Convoys could not be protected everywhere, escorts could not be concentrated everywhere, and every decision to reinforce one route would leave another exposed. Geography made this mission even more critical. There were only a few narrow passages through which a large surface ship like the Bismarck could reach the open Atlantic. These choke points were watched, patrolled, and contested. If the ship passed through them undetected or unchallenged, the cost of stopping it later would increase dramatically. Time also mattered. Each hour the Bismarck remained at sea without contact expanded the area that had to be searched. Each mile gained increased uncertainty. What began as a limited operation near European waters threatened to become a wide-ranging pursuit across the Atlantic. This was the moment when strategy became movement. Once the Bismarck crossed those geographic thresholds, restraint would no longer be an option. Britain would be forced to escalate, not because the ship had already done damage, but because allowing it to operate freely was too dangerous to accept. The entire operation depended on one critical assumption: that the German battleship Bismarck could reach the open Atlantic without suffering damage that limited its operational range. That assumption failed early. During the first major contact with British forces, the Bismarck was hit, not in a way that crippled its guns or rendered it unable to fight, but in a way that mattered far more to the mission itself. Its fuel system was compromised. At first, this damage did not appear decisive. The ship could still maintain speed, it could still maneuver. To an outside observer, it remained a powerful and dangerous battleship. But the consequences of the hit unfolded over time. Fuel loss imposed limits that could not be reversed at sea. Every hour of movement now carried a hidden cost. Every change of course reduced the margin for error. Options that had existed at the start of the mission quietly disappeared. This was not a tactical setback. It was a structural failure. The Bismarck could still fight. It could still outrun many opponents. But it could no longer operate freely across the Atlantic as intended. What had been designed as an open-ended operation, one without a fixed timeline, collapsed into a finite problem governed by distance, consumption, and time. For German planners, this altered the logic of every subsequent decision. Routes had to be reconsidered. Priorities shifted from opportunity to preservation. The mission was no longer about imposing pressure on Britain, but about preventing further deterioration. For Britain, the implications were immediate. The ship was no longer an unpredictable threat, roaming an ocean too large to contain. It was now a target with measurable limits. And once limits are known, planning becomes possible. This was the true turning point, not because the Bismarck had been defeated in battle, but because the strategic conditions that protected it were gone. From this moment forward, the question was no longer whether the Bismarck could threaten the Atlantic. It was how long it could continue to exist as an unresolved problem. Once the limits of the German battleship Bismarck were understood, the pursuit entered its final phase. This was no longer an attempt to locate a ship somewhere in the Atlantic. It became an effort to deny every remaining option. British forces did not rush toward immediate confrontation. Instead, they moved to contain. Ships were positioned to block routes rather than chase blindly. The objective was not speed, but control. With its operational range restricted, the Bismarck's choices narrowed hour by hour. Routes that had once offered escape now led toward interception. Turning south increased exposure. Turning west risked isolation without fuel or support. Turning north meant moving into areas where British forces were concentrating. There was no direction that led back to freedom. As time passed, the hunt became less about finding the Bismarck and more about managing its inevitable convergence with British forces. Geography began to work against the ship. The available sea space shrank as patrol lines tightened and likely routes were eliminated. Weather, which had previously offered concealment, now introduced friction. Rough seas reduced speed and complicated maneuvering. Poor visibility disrupted coordination aboard the ship, while British forces could afford to operate methodically, adjusting positions rather than forcing contact. Information played a decisive role. Sightings, reports, and intercepted signals steadily reduced uncertainty. Each new piece of information compressed the search area. The Atlantic, once vast and forgiving, became increasingly confined by what was known. By this stage, the Bismarck had ceased to function as a strategic weapon. It could no longer threaten convoys in a meaningful way. It could no longer force Britain to disperse its fleet. Its presence no longer reshaped the war at sea. It only shaped the conditions under which it would be removed. The hunt was no longer about whether the Bismarck could be stopped. It was about when, and under what conditions, the problem would finally be resolved. By the morning of May 27, 1941, there was no longer a strategic debate. The German battleship Bismarck had been located, constrained, and engaged. Its guns were damaged. Its steering was compromised. Its ability to maneuver was severely reduced. But it was still afloat. And as long as it remained afloat, it remained a problem that could not be ignored. A disabled battleship was not the same as a neutralized one. Even in a damaged state, the Bismarck retained mass, momentum, and the capacity to influence events. Weather could intervene. Damage control could stabilize the ship. A break in contact, even temporary, could reopen the problem entirely. In naval warfare, uncertainty carries its own cost. The British objective was therefore not to silence the Bismarck or to render it temporarily harmless. It was to remove it from the strategic equation altogether, not as punishment, not as retaliation, and not as a demonstration of power, but because any other outcome preserved risk. A floating wreck still demanded attention. It still required ships to remain nearby. It still imposed decisions and diverted resources. As long as the Bismarck existed as a physical presence, Britain could not fully disengage. This was the logic that drove the final phase of the operation. Fire was concentrated. Range was closed. The engagement continued not because resistance remained strong, but because survival, even in a degraded form, was still possible. Only when the Bismarck's fate was certain did the equation finally resolve. At that moment, the Atlantic did not gain a victory. It gained clarity. The problem that had forced Britain to stretch its defenses, commit its fleet, and accept strategic risk was gone. What remained was not triumph, but the absence of uncertainty. The destruction of the German battleship Bismarck did not end the Battle of the Atlantic. British convoys continued to sail under threat. German submarines remained active. The war at sea would continue for years, shaped by technology, production, and endurance, rather than by any single ship. But the question that had dominated May 1941 was resolved. The Bismarck had introduced a form of pressure Britain could not tolerate, the possibility that a single surface warship, operating beyond immediate control, could force an empire to defend an ocean too vast to secure completely. Once that pressure existed, it could not be managed through partial measures. It could not be contained indefinitely. It could only be removed. The ship was destroyed not because it symbolized German ambition, and not because it had already altered the course of the war. It was destroyed because it could have altered the war again. As long as the Bismarck remained afloat, it represented uncertainty, and uncertainty carried costs Britain was unwilling to accept. Ships had to be held back, routes had to be adjusted, Decisions had to be made in the shadow of what the ship might do next. In that sense, the Bismarck represents a limit, not of firepower, but of strategic tolerance. Some threats are not judged by the damage they inflict, but by the instability they introduce. They force choices, distort priorities, and impose risks disproportionate to their size. For Britain in 1941, the continued existence of the Bismarck crossed that line. And for the Bismarck, survival itself was unacceptable.